Born into desperate poverty at the dawn of the 19th century, Millard Fillmore climbed to the highest office in the land and inherited a nation breaking into fragments over the question of slavery. Despite his best efforts, the lines of the future battles of the Civil War were drawn, and Fillmore found himself rejected by his own dying party and denied renomination. After almost a quarter of a century out of the White House, he died in New York State in 1874. Fillmore, the second of 8 children, was born into an impoverished family on January 7, 1800. His family's small farm in upstate Cayuga County, New York, could not support them, and Fillmore's father apprenticed his son to a cloth maker, a brutal apprenticeship that stopped just short of slavery. Fillmore taught himself to read, stealing books on occasion, and finally managed to borrow $30 and pay his obligation to the cloth maker. Free, he walked 100 miles to get back home to his family. He was obsessed with educating himself. He pored over every book he could get his hands on and attended school in a nearby town for 6 months. His teacher, Abigail Powers, encouraged and helped him. She would prove to be the most influential person in his life. She was only 19, not even 2 years older than her pupil. After Fillmore received a clerkship with a local judge, he began to court Abigail Powers. The couple married in 1826. As a young lawyer, Fillmore was approached by a fledgling political party and asked to run for the New York State Assembly. In 1829, he began the first of 3 terms in the Assembly, where he sponsored a substantial amount of legislation. In 1832, Millard Fillmore was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. At that time, Andrew Jackson was president. Jackson's repeated clashes with Congress and his ambitious attempts to expand presidential power united several parties against him. Fillmore's own anti-Masonic party merged with the Whigs, which represented the older, more entrenched power structure and opposed everything that Jackson and the Democrats represented. In 1843, at the end of 4 terms in Congress, which were interrupted by one defeat, Fillmore resigned from the legislature. After unsuccessfully lobbying for the vice presidential nomination on the Whig ticket with Henry Clay and losing an election for governor of New York, both in 1844, Fillmore was elected New York State Comptroller, or Chief Financial Officer, in 1847. He won this election by such a wide margin that he was immediately considered a prospect for national office. The Whigs selected the military hero General Zachary Taylor as their presidential nominee for the election of 1848. The nomination of a slave owner who held property in Louisiana, Kentucky, and Mississippi infuriated abolitionist Whigs from the North. The party decided to balance the ticket by putting a Northerner in the vice presidential slot. Hence, Fillmore was chosen. The Taylor-Fillmore ticket won a bitterly fought election over the Democratic ticket led by Michigan Senator Lewis Cass. Taylor and Fillmore were an odd match, the products of very different backgrounds and educations and far apart on the issues of the day. The two men did not meet until after the election and did not hit it off when they did. In a short time, Fillmore found himself excluded from the councils of power, relegated to his role as President of the Senate. The critical issue facing President Taylor was slavery. Henry Clay had crafted a series of proposals into an omnibus bill that became known as the Compromise of 1850, a patchwork of legislation that would admit California as a new free state, organize New Mexico and Utah, the remainder of the Mexican Cession, as territories on the basis of popular sovereignty, and readjust the disputed boundary between Texas and New Mexico. The compromise also established a fugitive slave law that guaranteed that runaway slaves apprehended anywhere in the United States would be returned to their owners. Taylor refused to take a stand, and the compromise bill was stalled in endless debates in the Senate by mid-1850. But then the unthinkable happened: the president died, possibly of cholera. As president, Fillmore strongly supported the compromise. Allying himself with the Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas and appointing the pro-compromise Whig Daniel Webster as his Secretary of State, Fillmore engineered its passage. By forcing these issues, Fillmore believed he had helped to safeguard the Union, but it soon became clear that the compromise, rather than satisfying anyone, gave everyone something to hate. Under the strains of the failed agreement, the Whig Party began to come apart at the seams. On the international stage, Fillmore dispatched Commodore Perry to open Japan to Western trade and worked to keep the Hawaiian Islands out of European hands. He refused to back an invasion of Cuba by a group of Southern adventurers who wanted to expand the South into a slave-based Caribbean empire. This filibustering expedition failed, and Fillmore took the blame from Southerners. At the same time, he offended Northerners by enforcing the fugitive slave law in their region. Weary and dispirited, he tried to decline to run again but was prevailed upon to allow his name to be put forward only to lose the nomination to General Winfield Scott. Shortly thereafter, his beloved Abigail died, followed by his 22-year-old daughter Mary. In 1856, he ran for election as the presidential candidate of the Whig American Party, a fusion of the remaining Whigs and the anti-immigrant American, nicknamed Know Nothing, Party. He won the Electoral College votes of Maryland and 21% of the popular vote. But the newly organized Republican Party, even in defeat, eclipsed Fillmore and the Whigs, winning 33% of the vote, and Fillmore's poor performance marked the end of his party. Millard Fillmore died of a stroke in March of 1874. Millard Fillmore was the 13th President of the United States, serving from 1850 to 1853, the last president to have been a member of the Whig Party while in office. A former member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Fillmore was elected vice president in 1848, and succeeded to the presidency when Zachary Taylor died in July 1850. Fillmore was instrumental in passing the Compromise of 1850, which led to a brief truce in the battle over the expansion of slavery. Fillmore was born into poverty in the Finger Lakes area of upstate New York. Though he had little formal schooling, he studied diligently to become a lawyer. He became prominent in the Buffalo area as an attorney and politician, and was elected to the New York Assembly in 1828 and the House of Representatives in 1832. Fillmore initially belonged to the anti-Masonic Party, but became a member of the Whig Party as it formed in the mid-1830s. He was a rival for the state party leadership with the editor Thurlow Weed and his protege William H. Seward. Throughout his career, Fillmore declared slavery evil but said it was beyond the federal government's power to end it. Seward was openly hostile to slavery and argued that the federal government had a role to play in ending it. Fillmore was an unsuccessful candidate for Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives when the Whigs took control of the chamber in 1841, but was made chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Defeated in bids for the Whig nomination for vice president in 1844 and for New York governor the same year, Fillmore was elected Comptroller of New York in 1847, the first to hold that post by direct election. As vice president, Fillmore was largely ignored by Taylor. Even in dispensing patronage in New York, Taylor consulted Weed and Seward. But in his capacity as President of the Senate, Fillmore presided over its angry debates, as the 31st Congress decided whether to allow slavery in the Mexican Cession. Unlike Taylor, Fillmore supported Henry Clay's Omnibus Bill, the basis of the 1850 Compromise. Upon becoming president in July 1850, he dismissed Taylor's cabinet and pushed Congress to pass the compromise. The Fugitive Slave Act, expediting the return of escaped slaves to those who claimed ownership, was a controversial part of the compromise. Fillmore felt duty-bound to enforce it, though it damaged his popularity and also the Whig Party, which was torn between its northern and southern factions. In foreign policy, he supported U.S. Navy expeditions to open trade in Japan, opposed French designs on Hawaii, and was embarrassed by Narciso Lopez's filibuster expeditions to Cuba. Fillmore failed to win the Whig nomination for president in 1852. As the Whig Party broke up after Fillmore's presidency, he and many in its conservative wing joined the Know-Nothings and formed the American Party. Despite his party's emphasis on anti-immigration and anti-Catholic policies, during his candidacy in the 1856 presidential election, he said little about immigration, focusing on the preservation of the Union, and one only Maryland. During the American Civil War, Fillmore denounced secession and agreed that the Union must be maintained by force if necessary, but was critical of Abraham Lincoln's war policies. After peace was restored, he supported President Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction policies. Fillmore remained involved in civic interests after his presidency, including as Chancellor of the University of Buffalo, which he had helped found in 1846. Historians usually rank Fillmore among the worst presidents in American history, largely for his policies regarding slavery, as well as among the least memorable. His association with the Know-Nothings and support of Johnson's Reconstruction policies further tarnished his reputation. Millard Fillmore, a member of the Whig Party, was the 13th President of the United States, 1850 to 1853, and the last president not to be affiliated with either the Democratic or Republican parties. In his rise from a log cabin to wealth and the White House, Millard Fillmore demonstrated that through methodical industry and some competence an uninspiring man could make the American dream come true. Born in the Finger Lakes country of New York in 1800, Fillmore as a youth endured the privations of frontier life. He worked on his father's farm, and at 15 was apprenticed to a cloth dresser. He attended one-room schools, and fell in love with the red-headed teacher, Abigail Powers, who later became his wife. In 1823 he was admitted to the bar. 7 years later he moved his law practice to Buffalo. As an associate of the Whig politician Thurlow Weed, Fillmore held state office and for 8 years was a member of the House of Representatives. In 1848, while Comptroller of New York, he was elected vice president. Fillmore presided over the Senate during the months of nerve-wracking debates over the Compromise of 1850. He made no public comment on the merits of the compromise proposals, but a few days before President Taylor's death, he intimated to him that if there should be a tie vote on Henry Clay's bill, he would vote in favor of it. Thus the sudden accession of Fillmore to the presidency in July 1850 brought an abrupt political shift in the administration. Taylor's cabinet resigned and President Fillmore at once appointed Daniel Webster to be Secretary of State, thus proclaiming his alliance with the moderate Whigs who favored the compromise. A bill to admit California still aroused all the violent arguments for and against the extension of slavery, without any progress toward settling the major issues. Clay, exhausted, left Washington to recuperate, throwing leadership upon Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. At this critical juncture, President Fillmore announced in favor of the compromise. On August 6, 1850, he sent a message to Congress recommending that Texas be paid to abandon her claims to part of New Mexico. This helped influence a critical number of Northern Whigs in Congress away from their insistence upon the Wilmot Proviso, the stipulation that all land gained by the Mexican War must be closed to slavery. Douglas's effective strategy in Congress combined with Fillmore's pressure from the White House to give impetus to the compromise movement. Breaking up Clay's single legislative package, Douglas presented 5 separate bills to the Senate. 1. Admit California as a free state. 2. Settle the Texas boundary and compensate her. 3. Grant territorial status to New Mexico. 4. Place federal officers at the disposal of slaveholders seeking fugitives. 5. Abolish the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Each measure obtained a majority, and by September 20, President Fillmore had signed them into law. Webster wrote, "I can now sleep of nights." Some of the more militant Northern Whigs remained irreconcilable, refusing to forgive Fillmore for having signed the Fugitive Slave Act. They helped deprive him of the presidential nomination in 1852. Within a few years it was apparent that although the compromise had been intended to settle the slavery controversy, it served rather as an uneasy sectional truce. As the Whig Party disintegrated in the 1850s, Fillmore refused to join the Republican Party, but, instead, in 1856 accepted the nomination for president of the Know-Nothing, or American, Party. Throughout the Civil War he opposed President Lincoln and during Reconstruction supported President Johnson. He died in 1874. Millard Fillmore became president upon the death of Zachary Taylor in July 1850. Born in upstate Cayuga County, New York on January 7, 1800, Fillmore as a youth endured the privations of frontier life. He worked on his father's farm, and at 15 was apprenticed to a cloth maker. He attended a local school where he met Abigail Powers, who was 19 years old at the time. They later married in 1826 and had 2 children. In 1823 he was admitted to the bar. 7 years later he moved his law practice to Buffalo. As an associate of the Whig politician Thurlow Weed, Fillmore held state office and for 8 years was a member of the House of Representatives. In 1848, while Comptroller of New York, he was elected vice president. Fillmore presided over the Senate during the months of nerve-wracking debates over the Compromise of 1850. He made no public comment on the merits of the compromise proposals, but a few days before President Taylor's death, he intimated to him that if there should be a tie vote on Henry Clay's omnibus bill, he would vote in favor of it. Millard Fillmore's sudden accession to the presidency brought an abrupt political shift in favor of trying to give more ground to the Southern advocates of slavery. Taylor's cabinet resigned, and President Fillmore at once appointed Daniel Webster to be Secretary of State, thus demonstrating his alliance with the moderate Whigs who favored the compromise. When Clay's omnibus bill failed, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois broke the legislation into 5 separate bills, submitting them in piecemeal fashion. At this critical juncture, Fillmore announced his support of the compromise. On August 6, 1850, he sent a message to Congress recommending that Texas be paid to abandon her claims to part of New Mexico. Douglas's effective strategy in Congress, combined with Fillmore's pressure from the White House, gave impetus to the compromise movement. The acts passed both chambers of Congress, and were signed by President Fillmore in September 1850. These pieces of legislation admitted California as a free state, organized the territorial governments of New Mexico and Utah on the basis of popular sovereignty, established a boundary between Texas and New Mexico, abolished the slave trade in the nation's capital, and strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act. Fillmore believed that his efforts had averted a major crisis and saved the Union. Instead, this sectional truce left most factions unsatisfied. Fillmore's signing of the Fugitive Slave Act was also heavily criticized by abolitionists. By law, the federal government was now required to assist slave owners in recapturing enslaved people, even if they were found in states where slavery was outlawed. There were also harsh penalties for anyone caught assisting or hiding enslaved people. As the Whig Party splintered over slavery, Fillmore lost critical support from Northern Whigs who opposed the institution. As a result, he lost the 1852 presidential nomination to General Winfield Scott. In 1856, he accepted the nomination for president from the National American Party, also known as the Know-Nothing Party. While he was handily defeated, Fillmore captured more than 20% of the popular vote and won the state of Maryland. With this defeat, Fillmore withdrew from politics and focused more on philanthropic endeavors in Buffalo with his second wife Caroline. During the Civil War, he supported the Union and different leaders from both political parties who sought to save it. He suffered a stroke and later died on March 8, 1874. Fillmore is ranked by historians and political scientists as one of the worst U.S. presidents. His handling of major political issues, such as slavery, has led many historians to describe him as weak and inept. According to biographer Scarry, no president of the United States has suffered as much ridicule as Millard Fillmore. Scarry ascribes much of the abuse to a tendency to denigrate the presidents who served in the years just before the Civil War as lacking in leadership. For example, President Harry S. Truman later characterized Fillmore as a weak, trivial thumbtwaddler who would do nothing to offend anyone and as partially responsible for the war. Fillmore's name has become a byword in popular culture for easily forgotten and inconsequential presidents. In 2010, Anna Pryor wrote in the Wall Street Journal that Fillmore's very name connotes mediocrity. Fink Hellman, another Fillmore biographer, comments, on the central issues of the age his vision was myopic and his legacy is worse. In the end, Fillmore was always on the wrong side of the great moral and political issues. But Rayback applauds the warmth and wisdom with which he had defended the Union, and Smith finds Fillmore a conscientious president who honored his oath of office by enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act rather than govern based on his personal preferences. Stephen G. Calabrese and Christopher S.U., in their study of presidential power, deem Fillmore a faithful executor of the laws of the United States, for good and for ill. But according to Smith, the enforcement of the act has given Fillmore an undeserved pro-Southern reputation. Fillmore's place in history has also suffered because even those who give him high marks for his support of the compromise have done so almost grudgingly, probably because of his Know-Nothing candidacy in 1856. Smith argues that Fillmore's association with the Know-Nothings looks far worse in retrospect than at the time, and that Fillmore was not motivated by nativism in his candidacy, despite the letter he wrote for publication that stoked fear about immigrant influence in elections. Benson Lee Grayson suggests that the Fillmore administration's ability to avoid potential problems is too often overlooked. Fillmore's constant attention to Mexico avoided a resumption of the Mexican-American War and laid the groundwork for the Gadsden Treaty during Pierce's presidency. The Fillmore administration also resolved a controversy with Portugal left over from the Taylor administration, smoothed over a disagreement with Peru over Guano Islands, and peacefully resolved disputes with Britain, France, and Spain over Cuba. All these crises were resolved without the United States going to war or losing face. Grayson also applauds Fillmore's firm stand against Texas's ambitions in New Mexico during the 1850 crisis. Fred I. Greenstein and Dale Anderson praise Fillmore for his resolve in his early months in office and note that Fillmore is typically described as stolid, bland, and conventional, but such terms underestimate the forcefulness evinced by his handling of the Texas-New Mexico border crisis, his decision to replace Taylor's entire cabinet, and his effectiveness in advancing the Compromise of 1850. Political scientist James E. Campbell defends Fillmore's legacy, writing, "Historians have underrated him, his detractors have unfairly maligned him, and the institutions he honorably served have disrespected him." Campbell argues that the Compromise of 1850 did more good than harm for the nation and the anti-slavery cause. Fillmore and his wife, Abigail, established the first White House library. There are a number of remembrances of Fillmore. His East Aurora house still stands, and sites honor him at his birthplace and boyhood home, where the Millard Fillmore Memorial Association dedicated a replica log cabin in 1963. A statue of Fillmore stands outside Buffalo City Hall. On February 18, 2010, the United States Mint released the 13th coin in the presidential $1 coin program, bearing Fillmore's likeness. Thank you for watching this video.